Hey guys, Janus here. Today I'm going to be doing my in-depth Jelqing analysis and then giving my own much better spin on this exercise. Starting off, I'd like to do a bit of review. On the board here, I have drawn a cross-section of the male member and labeled a fairly recent discovery I made that I chose to call the Bulbo-Dorsal Circuit. Starting from the back, we find the internal pudendal artery, which then forks and goes into both the Corpora Cavernosum and then the Corpora Spongiosum. While there are more branches of the internal pudendal and more pieces to this hand-drawn illustration, I would like to draw everyone's attention first to the Corpora Spongiosum and its bulbourethral artery. Following the bulbourethral artery, we find that it travels the length of the Corpora Spongiosum and then terminates into the glans, where it radiates outwardly and then eventually makes contact with the next structure I would like to show everyone. That is the dorsal vein. For teaching purposes, I have greatly simplified the flow of blood from the Corpora Cavernosum to the dorsal vein. As blood from the bulbourethral artery moves through the Corpora Spongiosum and glans, it then flows through the dorsal vein. This flow then causes instances of negative pressure inside the venous tributary channels running along the side of the Corpora Cavernosum. This negative pressure pulls blood from the Corpora Cavernosum, thereby pulling blood through the deep cavernosal artery. In this way, by physically manipulating the Corpora Spongiosum and glans, blood can be made to travel through the Corpora Cavernosum at an accelerated rate. This will be important to the discussion later on. Now, as many of you know, Jelqing consists of forming an OK sign with your thumb and index finger, and then wrapping this around a partially engorged member, applying a bit of a squeeze, and then moving this constricted OK sign up your shaft, but not over your glans. Done properly, it should cause an increase in pressure in the distal portion of your shaft in front of your fingers. This pressure causes an expansion of the Corpora Cavernosum chamber along with a bottleneck effect, which forces blood to rapidly move through the constricted ring of flesh just beneath your fingers. This rapid movement causes something I've covered in previous videos known as shear stress. Shear stress is a blood-based friction along the internal walls of our blood vessels that stimulates the glycocalyx and endothelial cells. Furthermore, due to how the OK grip slides over the Corpora Spongiosum, we get a bit of Bulbo-Dorsal Circuit activation. Thus far, the picture painted doesn't sound too bad. However, in prior videos, I talk about how arteries are known to penetrate the central masses of a given tissue and then radiate out in all directions. At the furthest reaches of our capillary bed, we find that the arterial side of our circulatory system begins to streamline and become our venous system. This important aspect of our circulation typically runs along the outside of a given tissue. It's because of this naturally occurring arrangement that we run into a fairly big problem. By performing a Jelq, we not only move blood through our corpora chambers through our arterial side of our circulatory system, we also force it backwards through our venous system, along with greatly increasing the pressure inside the veins in the given area. Even with relatively few bouts of this type of strain, it's entirely too common to severely damage their delicate walls and important internal structures, which all too quickly leads to something called varicose veins. Just to help everyone understand the difference between a varicose vein and a normal vein, I've drawn two of them side by side so that way everyone can get a real appreciation for what exactly has happened. Notice how the varicose vein has an outward ballooning and that the wall has been thinned. Then, see the large gap between the two damaged valves. As pressurized blood was forced backward through this vein, it caused long-lasting damage to both its walls and specialized gating system, which ensures that blood flows in one direction and not made to pool in our capillary beds. Put even more simply, this vein is now almost completely incapable of doing its job. However, I will cover in later videos how this type of damage can be healed by moving blood through the veins in the proper direction. This is an aspect I will address in my penis health and growth indicators video. While the initial picture I painted of Jelqing seemed to be promising, its propensity to cause severe damage to our venous system counts as a fairly big strike against it. What's worse, the hits keep coming. There's one thing about Jelqing that made me immediately suspicious about its supposed effectiveness as an exercise capable of causing male sexual organ growth, and that is pressure. Years ago, I distinctly remember thinking, if hypertension and high blood pressure causes trauma to capillary beds, which can lead to fibrosis and a loss of functionality in a given tissue, why would someone think that it would be any different for the penis? And the answer is, it's not. Allow me to be more specific. Along the inside of all of our blood vessels, there's something called an endothelial cell. These cells are responsible for producing nitric oxide and maintaining our vascular functionality and tone, and they're also highly sensitive to pressure. Even relatively short bouts of high pressure cause a significant decrease in functionality and therefore nitric oxide release. A drop in functionality, I might add, that can last for quite some time. This can extend to hours or even days. It all depends on the severity, and if the severity is high enough, it can cause cell death, which can easily result in an enormous fall off in localized nitric oxide levels for even longer. Putting it mildly, this is something that guys want to avoid at all costs. Talking further, what exactly does happen when nitric oxide levels fall off? As I stated prior, nitric oxide is responsible for maintaining vascular functionality, so whenever nitric oxide levels are depressed and remain that way for an extended period of time, smooth muscles in the affected area lose their ability to work as a contractile-based unit and instead undergo a metamorphosis known as a phenotype switch. This phenotype switch takes a once contractile-based smooth muscle unit and transforms it into a synthetic type cell, which begins rapidly producing collagen and then dumps it into the surrounding area as it slowly encases itself in a type of protein-like shell. Putting it very bluntly, lowered nitric oxide levels quickly equates to fibrosis. Put even more bluntly, a loss of endothelial cell functionality quickly causes erectile dysfunction. This is why nearly any form of pressure-based exercising is subject to immediate suspicion. And unfortunately, a lot of traditional PE exercises rely very heavily on pressure-based forces. Basically, Jelqing has two big strikes against it. One is the damage to the veins that run along the outside of the male member, very specifically along the sides of the Corpora Cavernosum and then along the top. The second is repeated bouts of unnatural pressure levels inside the distal portion of the shaft, and the third one is something that nearly any guy who has tried Jelqing can attest to, is staving off an erection. A lot of men, they don't even bother. They just try performing a Jelq on a nearly erect member, which only compounds the first two problems several-fold. For me, Jelqing has one too many nails in its coffin for me to consider it anything approaching effective or safe. But I wonder, was it always as we know it now to be? While I wouldn't go so far as to call myself a history buff, or a child of the world, so to speak, in terms of traveling, I can say with a fair bit of humor that a lot of things get lost in translation, even with modern marvels like Google Translate, for instance. If we accept that Jelqing may have an origin hailing from some of the deeper regions of the Middle East, or possibly even further, then there are a few realities that may call into question the true nature of the Jelq. Before the invention of modern modes of travel like planes, trains, or automobiles, vast distances were covered on foot, whether yours or an animal's. In either case, a great deal of walking was involved. This means that even relatively small distances of, say, 30 miles or so could take all day and some ways into the night to travel, especially if it meant traversing harsh landscapes. In fact, in those cases, even a fraction of that distance in a day would be commendable. So, factoring in the very literal thousands of miles that would need to be covered it's not unreasonable to assume that traveling from the reaches of the ancient East to the farther edges of Europe could take months, if not years. That kind of a vast distance presents two big problems. The first would be information relaying, and the second would be time. Talking on the first, we know that there's a huge difference that exists between the languages favored by the ancient East and that of Europe. This difference comes down to complexity, meaning, symbology, arrangement, you name it. That, in of itself, should make anyone automatically look sideways at any information sources hailing from the East. Then, here's the best part. We factor in the possibility for a high illiteracy rate in the people that are translating or otherwise carrying this information. An extremely daunting task becomes damn near impossible. Basically, information will be lost in translation, quite possibly a lot. Now we factor in time. So let's say by some minor miracle that at least somewhat of a meaningful message was able to make it across such a vast distance, and who knows by how many different kinds of translation, we run into the problem of fact-checking. How long after the first message made it to Europe would it take for someone to notice a few key parts of translation were wrong? A few years? Maybe a decade or so? A couple centuries maybe? Then how much more convoluted would it become because of the initial translation errors? How cemented would the fallacious understanding become by the time someone actually got around to confronting it? Suddenly, Jelqing as we know it looks awfully flimsy. The last and biggest kicker is developmental differences. The ancient East is old, like sand and dust of the earth, old. There are civilizations in Asia that are so old they outdate the birth of Christ by thousands of years. And that's just the records we've recovered or monks passed down through the countless millennia. Any civilization that's got that much time under its belt is no pushover academically. Saying they knew a lot doesn't even cover it. Asia, also known as the sleeping giant, has forgotten more knowledge than our piddly civilizations of today can even comprehend. Let me put it in perspective. America is less than 400 years old. That's like comparing a toddler to a doting grandfather. That's a big, big difference. Europe, compared to Asia, is still no better than a single-digit adolescent. All of this amounts to saying that the differences in the level of information density would have made accurate translating a very daunting task. Even with our modern translation services of today, it's still very common to come across big mistakes. I fully believe our modern-day interpretation of the Jelq to be something akin to blasphemy, and I'll explain why. The closer we get to approaching the East, the more we must come to understand qi, or the flow of energy and fluids through the body. More specifically, how important it is to a person's health not to impede flow, but instead encourage or beneficially redirect it. As I look at the modern-day interpretation of the Jelq, I cannot help but think that it stands in opposition to the tenets of qi. So, how might it have looked perhaps a few thousand years ago? Keeping in mind that so far as we're aware, humans have not undergone any significant changes in functionality, which would mean that a few thousand years ago, blood more than likely moved through the male sexual organs along extremely similar, if not an identical path, and this is where my discovery of the Bulbo-Dorsal Circuit comes into play. As I examine the Jelq exercise, in the light of my recent studies regarding male and female couplings and how blood flows through the male member, I could not help but notice how a few simple adjustments radically changed the feel of the exercise and finally paid homage to the tenets of qi. Something which I find almost fateful is that not long after revealing my discovery of the Bulbo-Dorsal Circuit to the world, a few men near instantaneously started drawing connections between Jelqing and it. Before I could even get this video released, I've already heard mention of what I call Jelq 2.0 on forums and in chat rooms from America to Europe and beyond. In the description of this video, I've included a written description of what I call Jelq 2.0, along with how to perform the exercise either with or without lubrication. As more men adopt this version of Jelqing, I feel confident that it will more than likely come to replace its predecessor. Well everyone, I hope that you found this week's video to be both informative and entertaining. And as always, I'm your host, Janus, signing off.